It's so nice to have you at Wisdom 2.0, finally. I think we've tried for a number of years, but it's a real pleasure to have you. And it's interesting that panel that just happened between us and how people have taken a really traumatic experience and are using it to heal. And I know that's a big focus of MAPS on really understanding how do we heal trauma. But because not everybody in here might know of MAPS, I thought we could just start by possibly us with a short definition of the organization and kind of what your areas of focus are.
Yeah. I guess first I'd really just like to thank you, Soren, and all of you for doing the work you've done to try to help mainstream mindfulness and make that something more accepted. And that's laid the groundwork for us who are now trying to mainstream psychedelics. And so if it wasn't for the work that you've done, we wouldn't be quite in the spot that we're in now.
We'll take full credit.
So MAPS is basically a nonprofit pharmaceutical company focused on psychedelics and marijuana. I learned about MDMA in 1982 when it was known as Adam, which was a code name for its use in therapy circles, but it was also starting to be sold as ecstasy. And so it was clear that it was doomed. Eventually, this was during Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan, the escalation of the drug war again. And so I started a nonprofit in '84 before MAPS to try to protect the therapeutic use of MDMA. And we sued the DEA. We actually won the case, but the DEA ignored the ruling of the judge that the therapeutic use of MDMA should stay legal. And in that defeat, I recognized that there was only one way to bring MDMA and psychedelics really back into acceptance, and that was going to be through science and medicine focused on healing. And I also recognized that the governments weren't going to pay for this research, the pharmaceutical companies weren't going to pay for it, the major foundations weren't going to pay for it. So MAPS then began to be the vehicle to try to do this, to try to really do a nonprofit psychedelic and medical marijuana pharmaceutical company.
Great.
What I didn't realize is that no drug had ever been made into a medicine by a nonprofit at that time.
Because of the resources it takes?
Because of the resources it takes, and because the pharmaceutical companies were moving forward in a lot of different directions. So the first drug that ever became a medicine in a nonprofit context was the abortion pill, RU46.
Wow.
And that was in 1999. And that was the John D. Rockefeller III's Population Council, and Warren Buffett was one of the major funders.
Oh, okay.
So controversial drugs abandoned by the pharmaceutical industry are now starting to be taken up by nonprofits.
Beautiful. And so one of your focus has been healing severe PTSD and using MDMA. Can you tell us a little bit about why you chose that particular situation and why you chose that particular intervention, and also what you're finding from some of that research? Because I believe it's on the trials have been going for several years.
Yeah. So what I like to say is that we don't do science, we do political science. And by that I mean that when you think about taking something that's been marginalized and suppressed, you have to think carefully about who the patients are that you want to treat and what drug that you want to bring forward. So really it's about psychedelic medicine. But MDMA is the most gentle of all the psychedelics. And one of the things that we believe to be the true is that therapists and psychiatrists who would work with these drugs will be more effective if they've done them themselves. And so there's more resistance among psychiatrists and psychotherapists to taking psilocybin or LSD or a major psychedelic because of the ego dissolution, the challenges of it, than there are if they were to take MDMA. That MDMA is more gentle, more reassuring, it doesn't really dissolve the ego in that same way that the classic psychedelics do. So MDMA was the choice for the drug that would hopefully make it through the system first.
Okay.
Then we had to think about what was the proper patients.
Yes.
And so MDMA is terrific for trauma. If you were to design a drug to treat post-traumatic stress disorder, MDMA would be it because of the various physiological things that it does.
And you also want to explain what actually MDMA is, so feel free to work that in.
Okay, so what we need, though, is highly sympathetic patient populations. And so we know that trauma drives addiction. Trauma drives escape. But addicts in our culture, or people that are dependent on drugs, are more the other. And so we felt that we couldn't start there. We also thought about working with people near the end of their lives who were dying, who were scared of dying. And that's a really good population because in general, people are more scared of death than they are of psychedelics. So if you can work with psychedelics to help them deal with their fears of death. So that was one choice of population. But in our culture, we have such a respect for veterans, and there's such a public issue now with veterans with trauma. The thing that people most miss a lot is that there's way more people with childhood sexual abuse, with adult rape and assault, with PTSD than there are veterans. And so we are including in all of our studies people with PTSD from any cause. But what gets the most attention is the work with the veterans.
Right.
And so what PTSD does is PTSD changes your brain. And if you have PTSD, you're not thinking as rationally anymore. You're emotionally driven. And so the prefrontal cortex activity actually is reduced over normal brain. And you're also hypersensitive to fears, to triggers, to anything that reminds you of the trauma. So the amygdala, the portion of our brain that really responds to fear, is hyperactive in people with PTSD. And there's problems with memory storage with PTSD. It seems like the trauma is always re-experiencing. It's never quite in the past. It's always about to re-happen. And you see the whole world through the filter of the past trauma. So MDMA does the opposite. We actually had one veteran in our study say, PTSD changed my brain and MDMA changed it back. So what MDMA does is it increases activity in the frontal cortex, so you can be more logical and store memories in more context. It reduces activity in the amygdala so that you don't react with such fear to painful emotions. And it increases connectivity between the hippocampus and the amygdala, where we move memories into long-term storage. And so it also stimulates serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and hormones of oxytocin and prolactin. And so those are the hormones of nursing mothers, the hormones that we have when we're in love, and that builds the therapeutic alliance. That builds a certain willingness for the patient to interact with the therapist in a more open and trusting way. So all of that is what MDMA does, and we have now just begun a $28 million experiment that we've raised entirely in donations. So this is all nonprofit donations, and we're starting what's called phase 3. We actually, from 1986, when I started MAPS, the first 7 years, we got rejected for absolutely everything. And then we were able to start in 1993 with the first safety study. And that took us through the 90s. And then in 2000, we started doing work with PTSD patients. And so we've basically had 16 years of phase 2 studies in Israel, Switzerland, Canada, and the United States. And so phase 3 is the final stages where you have to prove safety and efficacy in order to get permission to market a drug. And so we've just started phase 3, 11 sites in the United States, 2 in Israel, and 2 in Canada. And that's where we're going to be spending this $28 million. And we anticipate by 2021, by the end of it, that we'll have FDA approval for prescription use of MDMA. But what's I think even more remarkable is that progress is actually happening sooner. So there's a program that the FDA has called Expanded Access, and it's otherwise known as compassionate use. And what that means is that if a pharmaceutical company is, in this case MAPS, is studying a drug, and you have enough people for phase 3, we're going to need between 200 and 300 people in phase 3, but we have over 20,000 people on a waiting list. Who want to be in the studies. We have over 8,000 therapists who want to go through our training program. So the expanded access says that if you have a disease, nothing has helped for that, and there's a drug being studied for that, you should be able to get that on a compassionate basis at your own risk, because the drug isn't through the system, and at your own cost. So we are starting to train therapists to set up sites that are called expanded access sites, and they'll be up and running this summer.
Wow.
So that we're actually going to be able to have psychedelic clinics. And
my wife is leaving Sunday to do the training, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we're hoping to have a psychedelic clinic in Santa Cruz.
And so what have been some of the early results that you've seen so far? So what in percentage of the people with PTSD after the program, can you give us some numbers in terms of what's happening?
Yeah, so the first thing to say there is, what is our treatment? So the treatment is 3.5 months long. And it's only 3 exposures to MDMA, and each of them are 8-hour sessions where people spend the night in the treatment center, and it's a male-female co-therapy team. So it's very labor-intensive. We started to say that our operating principle is, how do we maximize therapeutic outcome? We'll think about practicality, expense at a later point, but what's the best we can do? In a way, it was a little bit heartbreaking to see the previous panel, because we do have these tools that I think can be incredibly helpful. So we have 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions in addition to the day-long MDMA sessions. So 3 before the first session for preparation, and then 3 of these sessions after each MDMA session for integration, and then the 2 months after the last MDMA session is called the primary outcome measure. So what we are saying is that the placebo group is not actually getting nothing. They're getting roughly 42 hours of therapy, but without a drug. They get a pill that has nothing in it. And so we have about 23% of chronic severe treatment-resistant PTSD patients that no longer have PTSD.
23% in the trial?
In the trial, in the placebo group, from the therapy.
Group. Okay, 23%.
Yeah, so when you add MDMA, it goes up to 56%.
Wow, twice, more than twice.
More than twice as much.
They no longer have PTSD, They no longer
qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD.
Okay.
All right, but what we find is that once people learn that you don't need to keep suppressing the trauma, that you can process it, we do a 12-month follow-up, which is more for insurance companies to see if they'll cover it if the initial labor-intensive therapy persists, if it's durable. And so people keep getting better. So the main number is that the 12-month follow-up, 2/3 no longer have PTSD.
After a year, wow.
After a year.
Wow.
And then a lot of the others have had clinically significant reduction in PTSD symptoms. And if we could have given them a 4th session, they might no longer have PTSD as well.
So what's the difference? What actually changes? Because you said when they're doing MDMA, they still experience their trauma, but they experience it differently. Can you talk about what that shift is?
Yeah, there's a phenomena that's called fear extinction and memory reconsolidation. And so basically we have episodic memory and emotional memory, and they're linked together from different parts of the brain. So when we remember something, it's not like we're taking a book off the shelf, we're reading the book, and then we stick the book on the shelf. It's more like we take the book off the shelf, we look at this memory, and then we have to rewrite the book to put it back on the shelf. So what happens under MDMA is that people's memory for the trauma is enhanced. We've had various people who would say that, one in particular was a firefighter in a fire that the roof collapsed and about 10 of his associates got killed. And he said he remembered exactly what happened, but when he took MDMA, he realized that there was this whole big, most traumatic part that he had completely suppressed. So the memories come to the surface, and the MDMA gives this sense of peacefulness, of self-acceptance, of often self-forgiveness, and it helps you place this memory in the past. So you're basically swapping out the emotional memories. You're swapping out the fear that's always connected to that memory to something that's more peaceful. You accept that as part of your life, as part of your story. It's not like you suppress the memory, but you're not burdened by it as much. So then when you reprint the book of this particular memory and you store it away, the next time you remember it, you have a clear remembrance of what actually happened, but the emotion has been switched to one of peacefulness, and it's in the past. So that's this memory reconsolidation part.
So it opens up a space in you that allows you to have a different relationship to it, that one allows it, accepts it, but also doesn't have the same identification to it. Is that
Yeah,
close to
there's
it?
this sense that it would be overwhelming. So once the trauma is happening, people often have to suppress their emotions to help them survive whatever the event is. You have to be calmly thinking, how do you get out of this? You have to be reacting in a certain way, but you can't really break down to process your memories. And so there's this, under the influence of MDMA, in this setting, you're able to really process these memories and fully grieve or fully express the fears and anxieties. A lot of times people, well, one of the vets said, I don't know why they call this ecstasy. Because it's really very difficult, but people will shake or you know, a lot of, there's Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who's an expert on PTSD. He wrote a book, The Body Keeps the Score. But a lot of these traumatic memories are stored in the body as well.
Yeah.
So the MDMA really facilitates this mind-body connection, and a lot of this comes out in the body.
And you had told me, how many vets every so often commit suicide?
Well, roughly 20 veterans a day kill themselves.
Right.
Not all from PTSD, but a lot from PTSD.
Right.
And there's now roughly 1 million veterans receiving disability payments from the Veterans Administration for their PTSD. And the last time the VA put out numbers of how much that cost, it was an average of $20,000 per year per veteran on disability for PTSD. So that would be roughly $20 billion a year that the VA is paying for the emotional consequences of war.
Yeah. And so you're the 1 week treatment, it lasts 1 week, the treatment?
No, that was 3.5 months.
3.5 months.
So it's this once a month is the 3 MDMA sessions. Now, a lot of people get better after 1 session or 2, but our standard treatment now is going to be three MDMA sessions.
Okay. And then how about for people out there who like did a lot in college of something, and they're like, I kind of been there, I don't need to be doing any more of that, and they see the addictive nature of certain drugs. How do you balance this path of both the potential danger and then also the potential healing components of it? Is it the fact that it's done with a therapist and it's done in this certain setting? So how do you navigate that with people who are like, cool, I'm just going to go heal myself. Let's go take some acid and heal.
Well, I think a lot of people can heal themselves. And I think that actually points to a bigger message, which is that what we're trying to do is a strategy, but the bigger goal is mass mental health and mass spirituality. So it's about using MDMA for PTSD as a way for the culture to see that under certain contexts there's more benefits than risks, to open up in general to psychedelics, and then ideally eventually have people have these unitive spiritual experiences that have all sorts of political implications. But as far as this idea of recreational or celebratory or addictive potential, the key thing when people take drugs for recreational purposes is they only want to have a good time. They're doing it for good feelings, but that's very dangerous in some ways, because when difficult things come up, if you address them and work through them, that can be very healing. But if you suppress them, so you sort of are, on the one hand, bringing them to the surface with this drug that's sort of changing, you could say, the barrier, the membrane between the conscious and the unconscious, and more comes to the surface. But if you try to suppress the difficult experiences, you can end up feeling worse for months or years. So it's not inherently therapeutic. These are just tools, and it's the context and what they're used. So we say MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, but in that context, we track people and we don't see them developing long-term addictive patterns. They don't go back to using it. They don't see it as a fun escape. But I think that there is a lot of healing that's done in celebratory contexts. But we have to be careful to talk about the integration. So I think that's the other big part, is that when you take drugs in a recreational setting, people are looking for the short-term experience, but that's it. They're not thinking, what do I bring back? What do I integrate so that my baseline is different? So it's really about the intentions. Because
otherwise you have a certain high, and then the next day you have a headache and you're back to the baseline again.
Yeah, and you don't think about it. You thought, that was beautiful, why I was to process that, but how can I do that without the drug? So in a way, what we're doing with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is an anti-drug strategy. It's from a pharmaceutical company perspective, they want you to take a drug every day. They want it to control the symptoms, but not cure the problem. And they want you to take it for years and years. That's a good description of a lot of the drugs for mental illness that
Yeah.
Big Pharma. So we're talking about taking the drug in a therapeutic context only a few times,
Yeah.
and then ideally being free from drugs
Right.
afterwards.
Right, and 56% after a year, or
Well,
Yeah.
68%.
68%. Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
2/3. Yeah.
So we're out of time.
That was fast.
So fast. But you had this vision. I find it wild that you had it 30 years ago. You've been doing
I
how-
actually had this vision in 1972. So I just turned 65, but when I was 18, I did take this workshop with Joan and
Yeah.
one funny part about it was that I was just a super shy 18-year-old, and so they would disappear after the sessions. We wouldn't see them between the sessions. So we had this idea, they're so spiritual, they're doing Tantra in their room.
And I know we have to go, and the people backstage are telling me we have to go, but what was your sense, though, of, when I heard about it 10 years ago, because you're based in Santa Cruz, I'm like, that's crazy. Like, they're never going to get that legal, but go for it. But you had this sense of that there was something therapeutic, and there was, do you know where that came from? Is your own experience? And
I was retrospectively figuring it out, that I was very deeply traumatized by stories of the Holocaust. I'm from a Jewish family, born in '53, shortly after the war, and distant relatives killed. And that just terrified me, that thought. It was about the murderous nature of the human heart. And then I was further traumatized by the Cuban Missile Crisis, where now you're told maybe you'll survive this nuclear war, maybe you can hide under your desk and you can come out afterwards, duck and cover. And then the final thing for me was the Vietnam War. So I was in the last years of the lottery, and I studied a lot about nonviolent resistance, and decided that the best strategy would be to not register for the draft and have them put me in jail and not run away. I wasn't a conscientious objector, because you have to be a pacifist against all wars. So my parents were sympathetic, but they said, you're going to be a felon. You're never going to be able to have a normal job. You can't have a license as a doctor or lawyer as a felon. And I said, well, that's a sad price to pay, but I'm willing to pay it. And then when I started doing LSD, and I thought that this sense of connection beyond ego, as we're talking about, the political implications of this mystical, spiritual, is profound. And that's what animated a lot of what was going on in the 60s. So I thought, okay, I could be an underground psychedelic therapist, because I don't need a license for that. And so it was that intimation, and that's what led me to reach out to Stan. And so I felt that
a lot of people get ideas, though, and they don't spend 30 years pushing it. So there's something in you that has a 30-year steadfast determination, because I get a lot of great ideas, too. And how many other people have had great ideas? Like 30 years.
Well, 47 now.
47 years.
Since I was 60, I think it was fear. So I've been able to turn fear into an ally. So it's the fear of what people will do unless we find these tools to help them break through the separateness, break through the tribalism, break through and understand and appreciate our commonality. So it was the fear that we can, look at what's happening to the environment. The fear is real. And it was that fear that drove me this whole time.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Soren. Thank you all.